I'd just like to welcome Tim Sigsworth, who is I guess I have to admit somebody that I already know because I am a trustee of the organisation that Tim leads incredibly effectively, which is AKT. Rather than steal Tim's thunder, Tim, do you want to say a quick hello for us and just introduce who you are, please?
Yep. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I've come to a couple of meetings previously, and it's great to have this network. My name's Tim Sigsworth. I've been working professionally in the LGBT sector for 23, nearly 24 years now. But before that, as an activist, and this has been my dream job to work within different LGBT organisations over the years. And it's great to see you all today. So thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, it's such an honour to have you with us, and I of course know firsthand the amazing things that AKT does. So I'm really interested in talking to you, I guess, about a few different things. So, but before we kind of jump into that, as leaders, we are of course all human beings, and it's something that sometimes gets forgotten about. So I wondered if you're happy to share with us, if you could talk a little bit about your background, individually, and like what it was like kind of growing up and the start of that story, I guess, of how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I think my identity has always been inextricably linked to everything I've done in my career. I don't think that the two things have ever been separate. So from the accent you can guess, I grew up in a little town called Ebrey in the north, and I had my one and only girlfriend when I was 15. I sort of knew who I was, but she helped me find who I was, and I'm very thankful. I may not remember my boyfriend's name, but I remember Erica Unsworth, who helped me on that journey. Because when I came out, my mum rejected me, and because my dad was very poorly and was dying, she said, "You can stay and look after your dad, but the minute you're old enough, you're out the door." So I got a stay of execution at home as a kid, and that was it. I just used to run off to youth group in Manchester to meet other LGBT people, but I had no support from my family, and that's continued. My family is a logical family now of friends. So that's where I started out. And I have worked in a range of organisations, and I'll tell you a bit about that in a minute. But for me, it was just that first moment of realising I saw AKT happen while I was at youth group, and I was 3 years away from being able to access AKT. So if they'd opened the doors in '86, I would have been probably one of the first people who went there. But I stayed, looked after my dad, and when my dad died, who I think would have been the only person who would have accepted me, I did what I could do, and that's run away to university and start there. For me, the whole stuff that we do is very personal, because my first boyfriend died of an AIDS-related illness just before I went to uni, and my parents knew nothing about this before my dad died. And for me, I wasn't allowed to go to his funeral because his parents banned anybody who was from his lifestyle, as they called it. So I had all that, and obviously being a youngster in the '80s, it was a very difficult time. I think on the negative, there was so much social injustice that LGBTQ people faced. But on the other side, I just plunged myself into the activism. And I have to say, there's probably a lot of films of me messing about outside the town hall during the Section 28 rallies, where we got a little bit giggly, but we just went, we were there, and we were young people, and we were coming to terms with the fact that the world seemed against us, and we had so much that we needed to do. So it was inevitable that I would end up in a career in the LGBT sector, I think. So first of all, I went into social work and thought I could change social work. And it's a really difficult environment because people are being helped, but when it comes to social injustice, it was everywhere back then. And I remember being told on my first day, "We know you're gay, so don't come out to the kids you're working with, because they'll think you're a paedophile." That was my introduction to working as a social worker. So I just thought I was going to make a difference. So I stayed in mental health social work. Eventually, I moved out of youth work, worked into mental health social work, and then realised I wanted to be an activist properly within my job, because I'm a firm believer that you can be an activist. You know, you can be a standalone activist like Peter Tatchell. You can be an activist within your company, your organization. But for me, all I wanted to do was just find roles where I could make a massive difference alongside others. So I've worked in LGBT sexual health, founding HIV services. I've worked in mental health and actually set up the first mental health group for patients living in a secure unit, which has to be the most terrifying thing I've ever done, to go into a secure unit and just see how people are treated, and then have to see how LGBT people are treated. And just to give you a little sense of that before I wrap up about me, I turned up and I found out that every day when these patients who are in a secure hospital were invited to come to the LGBT group, the first thing that was said to them was, "Who's for the gay club? Who's coming to the gay club?" And can you imagine what that must have felt like for those people to hear that? I'm surprised anybody came along, but they did in their droves. So just to wrap up on this, I'm volunteered at several LGBT organisations, and I love the work that you can do around activism from within, and it's my passion. And I presume I'm going to end up running a gay retirement home one day, LGBTQ retirement home. That'll have to be the end of the journey for me.
Excellent. I mean, so many leaders, particularly in this network that we talk to, have their journey into leadership and their role as a leader is always connected with their past. And I guess with the journey you've been on, Tim, it makes perfect sense, therefore, that you've ended up where you are. And I feel like I should say thank you for all of that amazing work that you've done to kind of pave the way for everybody on this call, and particularly people in later generations. In terms of it, you're not just a LGBTQ plus activist, but you're also a really effective leader. And I've only seen part of the journey at AKT, but I know before my time even the organisation has grown almost by every measure by a factor of 10 under your stewardship. And any leader or director would be incredibly happy with those kind of results, be them in the voluntary sector or be them in the commercial sector. And I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about why it is you think you've managed to be so successful there. What is the secret to that?
Do you know, it's really interesting when you say that, and I think about what happens to so many of us LGBTQ plus people around our self-esteem. I can feel myself squirming. Obviously I'm ready to talk about this, but it's that feeling that how uncomfortable you can feel actually celebrating yourself and what you've achieved as an LGBTQ person. I suppose for me, I walked into AKT and I hadn't done my due diligence when I walked through the door, so I wasn't sure where they were up to. They had been started by a brilliant ally, Kath Johnson, and had, flown for some years, but they were struggling. And by the time I got there, I had a strong fundraising background and obviously social care background in the sector. So my first worry when I walked through the door was we were financially in a really very difficult position. We weren't seen as a going concern by our auditors. So we had a big hole there we had to fill. We also were working across 2 cities with a team of 5 people, including me. So it felt very unstable. So the thing for me as a leader, I had to go immediately, and I'm sure so many of you have done this, into crisis mode, to crisis management mode, business continuity, keeping on the side. So that was the big thing for me. So the first thing I needed was a team around me that could actually help me build. So I'm a great believer in you have to build your way out of these situations. You can't rely on just shrink. So my first thing was to build a team around me who were passionate and strong leaders. First role that I hired was not a services manager, because I could do that, but actually a fundraising officer, because that was critical. I needed £50,000 by the end of my first month. And the reason we got that money was because we tell stories. And I would always say it all starts with an impassioned story. And I told the story of the first young person I met when I walked through the door of AKT. Young man, he turned up at our office and he said, I've had my first sexual experience with this guy, and I've come out, my parents have thrown me out, you know, can you help me? I want a job on Canal Street and I want a flat on Canal Street. So yeah, in his world, we could make all that happen right in Manchester. And obviously we worked with that young person for a while, but we always encourage young people to take a sexual health test, HIV test when they come to us, and get some mental health support. So we build that in. And we found out from that first experience that he'd become HIV positive. And that I just thought, you're thrown out by your parents for being gay. And this is your first reaction. You're just, you know, this is what's happened to your life at such a young age. So that's the story we told to that first donor, who was a tax advisor. I remember really well, advised very wealthy people on tax, and we got £50,000 off that person, and that kept us open. So that was our first thing. The other thing that I'd like to say is, you've got the team, you've got the story, but also it's about the funding position. And we realized right early on, like 12 years ago, that we needed to diversify our income and ensure we had income that was at its early stages, midterm, and going out, so that we could keep that revolution going. And within that, the corporate partnerships were critical to us. So we started those partnerships, and our first corporate was Barclays, and they were great. But the thing that I battled with through all those relationships with corporates is the rainbow washing. You must have noticed how many logos went white on the 1st of July. And obviously that was really upsetting. So I'd just like to say, from our perspective, it's all about the due diligence. It's all about finding out what the motivators and passions are within an organisation. It's also finding out, what are you going to be doing with us in January next year? How are you going to provide opportunities for our young people, which are not just about the money you're going to give us? You know, are you going to provide some sponsored places, you know, shadowing in your environments? What are you going to give our young people? And that was key. So I remember one of our young people, we sent them to a law firm in the Magic Circle. Really weird environment for them, but they were struggling to actually, you know, decide what they wanted to study at university, where they wanted to be. So we sent them there. They wanted to be a lawyer. They wanted to be a human rights lawyer because of how AKT had helped them. But the sad story is, when they came out of the law firm, they decided they wanted to be a corporate lawyer. So we'd lost them to the corporate lawyer world. But the thing for them is, they got that start in life, and that's where a good corporate relationship comes from. And when we did set up our housing project, Purple Door, it was a consortium of corporate partners who basically built that money. They had 120 to raise. We managed to raise 180 from those people in that first period. So that was critical for us, get those corporate partnerships on board. I think the other thing in terms of financial modelling for us is that you bring together different partnerships. So you've got your statutory partners, although AKT was very clear, we would not rely on statutory funding. So it's 2% of our income now, which I think in an environment that's so volatile is a good place to be. So that's where we got to. We got we had statutory partners, corporate partners, and then we brought in people with specialisms across housing and other areas of business to build our Purple Door housing project. So it's about collaborative working for us. I suppose the last element for us within all of this, with a passionate team doing great work, is to keep independent and to follow our mission. I see so many charities that expand their mission, and some of them do incredibly well. And it's fantastic when people can diversify to meet the multiple needs of the young people they're working with. However, unfortunately, sometimes that goes really wrong and people spread themselves and they don't have the capacity to deal with that. So we've always been around homelessness. At the moment, we've got massive need around mental health amongst our homeless young people. But for us, the priority is to work with other partners on that, develop strategic relationships. And I think that's the only way forward for us, is to keep to our mission. And also, if we do that, we can have that flexibility in our service. So just my last point really from my perspective on AKT as a growing AKT is that we wanted to have the freedom to respond to young people's needs, not the needs of our funders. And that's really difficult because you've got a list of expectations from funders all the time. So hence why we focused our attention on building our donor program and our major donor program and building our corporate funding, because they would never turn to us and say that young person's in Kent, not London. We can't give you funding to work with that young person. This idea that you've got around Purple Door, you know, I know the young people have come up with that idea, but it's never been done like that before. We can't fund that. You have to do a traditional housing project. So for us, our independence has come through our funding model. So I suppose that's the journey.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's some real important lessons for leaders coming out of that. I suppose, you know, what I'm hearing throughout what you're saying is, you know, you perhaps didn't say it, but it really came across in what you said, is that, you know, you absolutely believe in the mission of this organisation, and through that storytelling, you've got a real talent to bring other people along with you to believe in that mission as well. And actually, I guess your humility that you touched on before is one of the reasons why you've always been so willing to kind of ask for help from people and put people in roles where you felt you didn't have, you know, as much background as others. So you talked about doing the service manager role yourself, but getting the fundraising done elsewhere. So, you know, I'm sure those are lessons that we can take to any organisation, not just voluntary organisations. And I guess that's one of the reasons that Claire and I wanted to do this, is that, you know, the power of having that network of people to give you that support and to bring along with you is so important. But often as LGBTQ plus people, we can be sort of cut off from those networks because of who we are. It was really interesting to hear the story of the some of the young people that you work with in that, and that you know, really really sad story of how things began for that young person that you talked about. A lot of leaders in the network that I talk to, perhaps they wouldn't sort of publicly admit this in the network now, but do sometimes express privately a fear that they have that, you know, things are very different these days, that actually, you know, young people are having very different experiences, using different language, talking about different concerns. You know, they see perhaps some of the backlash against rainbow washing that you talked about, and it feels different somehow. You're in a really interesting position where you're connected to so many young people. You know, what do we need to know as leaders about their lived experiences, so that we can, you know, be the best allies that we can, and indeed create some of those opportunities that you talked about for these young people as they enter the workforce?
I think if I look at 16-year-old Tim, and I look at a young person who walks through our door today, we've got some similarities in our experience, but the world of the young people today is completely different. And somebody once said to me, every generation has its challenges, and they may be different. And I think that's something really important for us, is to remember that there's specifics that we just don't understand because we're not living in that world. So if I was to talk about the specific young people we're working with, they have intersectional identities. I think the first thing I want to say is we used to work with LGBT people by just seeing the sexual identity. The sexuality was the focus. Now there's so much complexity. So we're working with young people who are people of faith, people of colour, people who are maybe from different identities within the gender and sexuality spectrum than we would have worked with 10, 15 years ago. So I think it's being aware of someone's intersectional identity and how each part of that impacts on their lives. So you can't just support a young person around their sexuality and forget that they're leaving, but they may be leaving it behind a faith system they've relied on all their life, or you're putting them into a culture where everybody looks differently than them. So, you know, work culture where they're invisible. I've just had this thing where we brought somebody into the organization and they said, I knew I was going to be in a team with lots of white people, but it's a really shock when you walk through that door and nobody identifies as you. So I think it's the important thing to say, you're not looking at a person through one lens. I think also the complexity of the situation. If I just take lockdown as an example, and a young woman called Ebrey, who it's not her real name, obviously. Jo, it's really complex. Her lockdown, she had to return home to an abusive family because she needed to isolate with, she needed to be safe for the lockdown. So she's in that environment that she's not been in. So her mental health suffered. And then on top of that, her job, she wasn't furloughed. She was basically let go because she was she was in this job where, we can let you go. We can't let other people go. So she lost her job. She was struggling with her mental health. She was facing the abuse that she'd run away from. So it's far more complex now for our young people. So what I'd say is, if somebody give people a chance. If you've got corporate recruitment programs for graduates, remember the people who, like Ebrey, who didn't get that opportunity, and think about, okay, what could run alongside that corporate program of graduates? What else could we bring in to let people in who are not graduates? How are we going to give that person support around their mental health and well-being? Because you can bet, whether it's your chief executive or the person who's just walked through the door, they're carrying something around their mental health and well-being. So it's just making sure there is that support in place for them. And there's plenty of schemes out there, I'm sure you're all aware of. So make sure that the mental health and well-being isn't left at the door. Make sure that you provide opportunities not just for graduates and people with a certain level. Also, the thing that we've done is look at our recruitment program. And one of my best directors who's come through our door has not had a traditional route, and talks about getting a job at an interview where there wasn't a big panel. It was a discussion about who they were before what they'd done. There's lots of things you can do in your recruitment process. And I'm sure I better be careful what I say. I'm sure charity people could write the book on that, but because they've done some brilliant work with us as well. But just thinking about how you recruit people, and not just focusing on a list of qualifications or a list of, they've gone through some really good firms. And I think the big thing for me on top of all of that is that remember that you might be the person who unlocks a key for, say, a lesbian person of color to get into a senior management post. So one things we've looked at is, okay, there's somebody here who's got these. You've obviously got positive discrimination that you've got to avoid at all costs, but there's also about positive change. And it's about looking at roles when you're advertising them and thinking, actually, let's swing between, maybe we want somebody who's an entry level in this, who's struggling to get to the next level, who isn't represented in their identity at that next level in other organizations, and bring them in. So I think that they're just some of the things I'd say. When just remember the complexity, remember the intersectionality, and just give people a chance. Because I think the best person I've ever worked with, who's now a chief exec, came in at a level, and the minute they walked through the door, we all said, that's the future chief executive. We said that about that person when they walked in the door in the senior management team. We knew what they could do, and it was nothing to do with the experience they had. It was it was the personality. It was just the way they handled things, pressure, etc. So that was really important for us, that we built in a whole mentoring program. I think just one last thing is coaching as well. I think we've got a coaching culture at AKT. I've been coached to death. I'm training to be a coach. We have coaches for the managers and senior managers, but we're doing mentoring and coaching programs with our staff. And also one of the things we're developing with our young people is, how can we get our corporate partners to coach young people in groups and do work with them, and individual coaching as well.
Great, thanks for that, Tim. We're going to open for questions shortly, so this is your chance all to tap some questions in the chat box. Whilst we just wait for some of those questions to come in, Tim, just one last question from me, really, which is, it's super inspiring to hear about not just the work of AKT, but about your personal kind of activism. For those of us on the call sat here, sort of thinking, I've not thrown any bricks at the town hall. You know, what should I be doing to be a better ally or activist in light of this? Have you got any sort of any asks of us or any suggestions for us that want to be more proactive, I guess, in our support for LGBTQ plus people?
I think it's about, obviously I'm going to talk about giving time, giving money, giving support, all those things. You make a difference. Sometimes you're making the difference, sometimes you empower somebody else to make the difference. I think that's the important thing. I think it can be as simple as, please don't like, share. Please don't just share, have an opinion. So thinking of digital channels, I love the fact that people like things, and I get very paranoid when people don't. I'm sure we all have that about, are we over 100 likes on something? But just if you see a message coming from charities like AKT and you believe in what they're saying, share it, talk about it, but also add your own view in there. Just say, I really believe in this, because it starts to generate that conversation, and then the threads come off that. But for us, supporting campaigns, we've got a campaign around monitoring within housing and homelessness services. It's the hardest thing for us. You know, we had a young woman who had her legs broken when she was moved into a housing association's property, because they checked out that there was low racial abuse in the area that she was going into, but nobody questioned whether there was a high rate of homophobia there, and there was. So she was put, because nobody asked her that question. So we're doing a mandatory monitoring campaign at the moment around that. So there's ways you can write to your MP, you can get stuff off us, you know, contact us and talk to us about what you need to do to kind of raise that level. I think the other thing is, it is the thing that I'm learning. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment around white fragility and the whole piece around anti-racism. And I think the most powerful thing is, silence is never the answer. We've been saying that since the 80s pandemic. And for us, most important thing people can do is you challenge, you learn to effectively challenge. And because that conversation will just go round. Every time we don't say something in the workplace, we are justifying it. And if we can't say it to the person because there's a power issue, then we find somebody who will listen. We get a mentor in the leadership team who will place their messages and challenges. And then obviously from us, I do believe activism begins in the pocket. It sounds brutal, but organisations like AKT get bigger and need more because more young people are coming through the door. During lockdown, 71% increase in young people coming through our door. It's phenomenal. And we're expecting that not to slow down, because a lot of young people have been trapped in lockdown with their parents and now finding ways to get out of their homes as the restrictions drop. So for us, £20 is all we need to provide a night off the street for a young person. But that night can stop stories like I told at the beginning of that young man who had contracted HIV on his first sexual experience on the streets, of the young people who've not obeyed lockdown rules, and I will tell you that now, who've gone out to find beds for the night on dating apps. So they've exposed themselves not only to the risks of an abusive person they don't know, but also to the risk of COVID at the same time. So your money will get translated into some impact. And I think that's the message. Every pound makes an impact at AKT. So if you can go on our website, /donate, and give to our summer appeal, that's you becoming an activist within literally, what will that take? 20 seconds, you're an activist. But yeah, I mean, I'm not all about fundraising, I promise. The other thing I just want to say is, God, thank you, Darren. Really, it will make, honestly, your activism goes a long way. Your impacts will last for years. But just to finish on that thing, if you're in a position of power, otherwise privilege in your organisation, you have got power throughout our community. You have the opportunity to say, why don't we work with this charity and give some coaching to young people from our senior leaders? Why don't we get involved in this project and, give our staff a day off to go and do that? Why don't we actually put a picture up of somebody from the community. Can you imagine the impact of putting a picture of, I'm going to use RuPaul. I'm not into Drag Race, but I'm going to use RuPaul. You put RuPaul in Lloyd's on the ground floor, that is going to cause more conversations than anything else. And that starts a dialogue around visibility. And,
Yeah, visibility.
and ultimately, how many LGBT people are in the FTSE 100 boards?
Yeah, and we probably don't even know, and that's one of the reasons we started this network. Was really Claire and I didn't we couldn't kind of name people, and so hopefully we're going to kind of discover more of those. But yeah, initially there, Tim, when you said don't like Cher, I thought you meant the singer, which would have been a very controversial suggestion amongst some gay men in the group, probably. But
I would have been doomed out of the whole universe for that. No way.
Excellent. So I'm just gonna flick over to some questions. I thought one point you made actually there was really interesting, which was your invitation for us to just ask, like, go to AKT or a charity and just say, what can we do for you? Because that's not something necessarily I think a lot of people would think that they could do. So starting a dialogue perhaps is something for us to think about as well. So I've got a question here from Tina, who says, hi Tim, thanks for sharing. Do you have any advice for a newish organisation in building an effective board?
Be careful what I say in front of Matt, won't I, on this one? But effective board, I think it's about asking those questions at interview, not about, oh, how many boards have you been on, or how much experience have you got in this area. It's about finding out what their values are, if they're aligned with you. A really good question to throw out is, where do you stand on trans rights? First of all, do they even know what trans rights are? Then secondly, where's their positioning? So I think always throw out the things that you're aligned behind, so see where their values are set. I think I'm going to come back to the fundraising one, which sounds a little cheap, but always make sure you've got people who've got a wonderful address book and who are not shy of sharing, whether it's resources, whether it's people. You always need that. I think you need inclusivity. A diverse board isn't just diversity in identity, it's about diversity in opinion. Unfortunately, I have to say, in my 23 years in the voluntary sector, I've never had a board who've just gone, great work, Tim, all the time. It's never been like that. I've had the biggest rows outside my relationship on a board all the time. So I think be willing to have that diversity of opinion, as long as it's obviously not around inclusivity, and build a diverse board. If you're starting out a board, you've got a wonderful opportunity to make sure you go outside the box. The other thing about a board, I would say, is it's coming back to that. Think of the people who are rising stars. I mentioned that person I worked with, was it about 14 years ago? Just walked into the office and we thought, that person is going to just do things. That's the person you need. You need to have people like that to invest in on your board. We have former young person on our board. He's got more lived and learned experience than I've got after all my years. Perfect.
Great, thanks, Tim. Claire, do we have any more questions from?
Yeah, we've got a few that have come in the chat, but I've also had one that's been pre-submitted from an ally who couldn't be here today and is going to catch up on the video afterwards. So this is somebody who's extremely concerned because there's a boy in her daughter's class at school whose parents are rejecting him for being gay. He's grounded in his house, his phone's been taken away. The teachers at the school know about it. And they're trying to offer some in-school support, but it's not classed as child abuse, so they can't get social services involved. What can this person do, this ally? What should the school be doing? What could we be doing in our wider community?
I mean, first of all, to say allies are the reason AKT are here today. We couldn't have set up homes for LGBTQ youth back in 1989. There's no way. Allies are critical. I mean, it's about resources in the school. You do not need a computer to look at a leaflet. This idea that if that young person is isolated at home, let's look at the school providing the resources and the inroads to organisations like AKT, because there are organisations working young people within schools. And I can send a list through, but AKT is a good point for them to start. And I think every teacher has a duty to look after the identity and safety of the young people they work with. I talk to my friends a lot about that. So go out for the information. You can get it from organisations like AKT. Use that information to create that connection, and then that person gets support. But you know, it's an interesting story. Young person came to us 6 months ago, and it must have been around just before we went into that nasty lockdown on just before the end of the year, and they picked up a leaflet about AKT in a police station, and that my eyebrows lifted as well when somebody said that. But for me, that's the thing: have the visibility there. First of all, it says, yeah, this school is interested, and secondly, it's a resource that young person can take, read, absorb, and then lose. It's not all about the digital work.
That's great. That's a great answer. Thank you, Tim. We've got a question from Dale as well. If our organisations were to take one first key step in supporting younger LGBTQ plus people to fulfil their potential, what would this be?
Well, go out and recruit young people, offer a programme where, and it can be really, I mean, you know about all the Kickstarter programs at the moment and the entry level stuff, but you know, just first of all, get your rainbows back up on your logos, force people to do that, force people to create a visibility, because being a Northerner, Pride season finishes at the end of August. Thank you very much. It's not June. So get some visibility up, whatever that is. You know, it's one of your leaders who's an LGBT champion or an LGBT person putting something out. But alongside that, the message that they should be putting out is, we're actively looking to reach out to young people who haven't got the start in life that they deserve. We're going to run some apprenticeships. You know, we're going to start with one, see how it goes, and start with that. Bring the people in, push past all your recruitment routes. Sorry, charity people, but push past all your recruitment routes and get some people in. Start that. Put the people there, then give them a coach who's in the senior leadership team. It's going to help them find the pathway.
That's a great answer as well. Another question from Richard. Richard's from Pride Out, which is an LGBT cycling group. You talked about the importance of helping young people with their mental health. How important do you think the role of sport and physical activity is in achieving this at AKT?
Massively, massively. And that's coming from somebody who's needs to do a little bit of work in that area himself. I know that, but we had this wonderful group of 2 young women who became really big friends, who joined, you know, found the camaraderie and support through a club, football at the women's football club. I don't know why we have to call it women's football club. Shouldn't it just be called a football club? But never mind. It's really important we do that. But they went to that group and made a massive difference to self-esteem and self-worth. And I think that's where physical exercise and sport has a role. It's not so much getting fit, it's just channeling your self-esteem and self-worth and getting some feeling engaged. There was a thing, just to finish off on that, and obviously it's slightly to the left of LGBT rights, but there was a thing about taking the knee this morning, and Sajid David had to respond to that question. Does he think it's right? And I was really disappointed in his answer. I'm sure they were pushing him because he's a person of colour. They were putting him on the spot. And his answer was, if people want to do it, they can do it. That's fine. But people shouldn't get upset about it. But that's not enough for me. If we look at football, for example, it's not taking the knee, great, it's a start, but there's got to be some action attached to it. You know, what they're going to do, the people who are ranting and raving, are they going to remove them from stadiums? Because is that football hooliganism? Probably is. You know, how they're going to actually ban the fans who are talking online and criticising and being really negative and abusive about this. That's what we have to see. But I think definitely physical health is mental health, really.
That's a great answer as well. Justin's asked for any advice about it being lonely at the top. and said that it's even lonelier when you're non-binary and single.
I get that. One thing that my chair and my previous chief exec always said to me is, you're on your own, Tim. You can't have friends at that level, you know. And I thought that was a really negative thing, because you can. I think the first thing I'd say is there will be other leaders out there, and it's about networks like these finding those leaders. So I think we often have to draw strength from people outside our organisation we trust. And I think there's always a little worry about that, especially in the voluntary sector, where we're all watching our hate needs really carefully, and we're scared of, you know, going to another chief exec and talking to them. But I'd say the first thing is find somebody you can trust and talk to. And they may not be at the same level as you. I mean, I can't name 5 non-binary leaders out there. So I would say find people maybe in different organizations at different levels you can talk to. I think also talk about that if you feel safe to talk about that on digital platforms, because I think there is a massive invisibility around non-binary leaders and non-binary people within corporates and other environments as well. So keep talking about that, because that's how you'll find other people. But absolutely reach out to others outside your organization.
Thank you. Tina's asked, how does she protect herself, members and the organization from Twitter pile-ons and attacks?
Oh, that's the golden bullet, isn't it? Sorting that one out. I think it's really difficult. I think you've got to close yourself down to haters. I get regular death threats and all sort of nasties, and people who direct message you saying they want to do business with you, but they just want to abuse you. I see that. So I feel for you in that situation. I just take the air supply away. Just do not, never respond to a hater online unless you think you can handle the outcome. Always just, you know, cut down on your use of Twitter if you can, because I find people are much more reasonable on other platforms. I think that's another thing. Twitter was set up for people, and I'm sure I can say this, people like Donald Trump to have a rant. It's not a positive environment now. So I'd say use other platforms, do not respond, cut people dead, and don't look at it, don't open it, because the haters' views are not important, because they're not built on informed opinions.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I think we're going to move into breakout groups now, but just a quick tip on here from Rachel, who said, if you're interested in recruiting apprentices, talk to your local college and they'll be able to support you. You may even have a levy pot to spend and the cost would be minimal. So, so that's a great tip there. Rachel's here, Rachel Nichols, if you want to drop her a line directly and ask about that. Matt, do you want to break us out?